Yeah, I that's my little intro. I'm with Blockspace Media. We have it's a Bitcoin industry media publication, and we do a lot of media and mining research. So, yeah, I have a presentation. So I think it may be categorized as like blockchain use cases, but I don't know if I really care to talk about that. I'm gonna lean into this token mining guy um role, and I instead am going to talk about how a block header is constructed and relate that into how into like the overall like business of Bitcoin mining. You want me to just go for it, Albert?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay,
The floor is yours to inspire.
let me share my screen. Okay, can we see this?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely.
I gave a version of this workshop in Amsterdam at the there's a conference there, and um I'm calling it how your JPEG gets into a Bitcoin block, the business of and the technical explanation of how your JPEG gets into a Bitcoin block. Yeah, just some context. Blockspace Media, I have a podcast, Bitcoin Season 2. I am in the more trad world as well. I'm on the board of the Oklahoma Bitcoin Association. We got like fiscal impact bills passed this past year. I've been mining Bitcoin for over half a decade, and yes, I did. I was a dirty Ethereum miner for a little while, but that was too profitable to ignore. And I'm in the business of making money and not being idealistic. And I've co-founded and I currently still operate a company named Nakamoto, which does this thing, mining Bitcoin off grid. If you're familiar with like mining Bitcoin at natural gas wells, we do this. You can see me and one of my co-founders here, and you can see one of our mines. We've got several locations in the central US. But I don't talk about that as much because mining is too hard. So I'm going to be a podcaster now. Like the operations side of Bitcoin mining is debilitating, and I found that you don't really need to know very much about Bitcoin in order to be a good Bitcoin miner. It's the great irony of it, and that's not really what gets me out of bed in the morning. I get way more interested in like how Bitcoin itself works. Um, so Okay, here's a rough outline. How is a Bitcoin block produced? A little bit of history of Bitcoin mining and how we got here. What the industry looks like today. A technical explanation of inscriptions and ordinals. And then if I have time, depending on the clock, I'll either take questions or I'll talk about like some esoteric Bitcoin stuff, such as like standardness, soft forks, given that you guys are just asking questions about OpCat and broader Bitcoin culture. Okay, so today Bitcoin mining generates a little over $30 billion US in annual revenue a year. If the price of Bitcoin goes up, then that number will also increase. And demands roughly 20 gigawatts of power. For context, that's like 4 New York cities and 1.5 Swedens. A lot of people are very critical of this, and I understand this, but I'll invert this fact and say that in order to attack Bitcoin in just one dimension, the 51% attack, you would basically have to redirect the entire infrastructure and energy production of 4 New York cities in order to attack it. And so this is one of the things that we call Bitcoin's security budget. And so the bigger that number gets, the more secure Bitcoin is in by some ways of measuring it. I think Bitcoin mining is a bit of a misnomer. I like to think of Bitcoin hash producers, who are the data center operators, versus Bitcoin mining pools, who are they run the software that coordinates the actual miners. I think it's increasingly important that we distinguish these two types of things. Even though we say Bitcoin mining, it's really the data center operators and the block producers. If you come from ETH or other like proof of stake chains, you may already kind of know this idea and distinguish between block producers. But in Bitcoin mining, we've kind of been kind of like dumb and reductionist. And so I think Bitcoin mining is a bit of an outdated term now. And here's the visualization. So you've got these giant data centers. This one is in Rockdale, Texas. And they're filled with these machines, these specialized computers, mining rigs. We may call them ASICs, ASIC, floor to ceiling. They're deafening. They produce a lot of heat and a lot of noise. And you've got the mining pools. You see this chart. You may recognize it from mempool.space. And it shows you basically a breakdown of what mining pools are producing the different mining pool blocks, or the different Bitcoin blocks. So how do you build a block? How does a block come into being? I like to think of a block as a container for transactions. You have a blockchain, blocks get added, which contain transactions, and the block itself contains the transactions which are added to the blockchain. A block is actually a block header plus the transactions in the block. And I'm going to talk a lot about the block header because that's where the business of mining really happens. So first you have to construct what's called a valid block header and then kind of put the transactions into the block. And if you want, you don't have to put transactions into the block if you don't like money. Some people don't like money for some reason and leave these blocks empty. But if you do like money and you do like pocketing those sweet transaction fees, as we've had this past week, you want to put the most profitable transactions in. So you get your block header and you assemble transactions. Each block starts out as a candidate block where we see the existing blockchain, and then all the different block producers, all the different people out there say, well, what might the next block look like? So they all get what's called a candidate block, and they put what transactions they think should be in there. They'll probably mostly be the same transactions, but they don't have to be necessarily the same ones. So they'll put those transactions in there, and they will then try to produce a valid block header for those transactions. So they'll look at the blocks in the blockchain, try to figure out the tip of the blockchain is, then you got to produce a valid block header, as I said. The block header contains the following in a few hundred bytes. It contains the Bitcoin version number, which is a way to track kind of which version of Bitcoin we're using. This is a way to track and identify soft forks. Like, are we all using the same version of Bitcoin, say with opcat enabled or without opcat enabled? We have a hash of the previous block header. We have a Merkle root of the Merkle tree of this block's transactions. So all the transactions in the block, we will hash them together into a Merkle tree and then put the root of that Merkle tree into the block header. We will timestamp the block in human Unix time. So if you go on mempool.space and you click on a block, it'll actually have in that block an actual timestamp in human time. And we'll have a difficulty target, which allows us to coordinate the block time, the average block time, and then the nonce. So what are these two down here? The miners are trying to go through nonces and produce a valid block hash. I may have misspoken, slightly technically inaccurate. The miner's not necessarily trying to find the valid nonce, they're trying to produce the valid hash. But if you're in computer science, you already know that a nonce stands for random number used once. And you basically need, a nonce is a random number. And so you go through all these random numbers, these nonces, and you use the nonce to produce a hash of the block header. And your goal is to produce a block hash which is under the difficulty for the Bitcoin network. And that just basically means that the hash has to have a certain number of zeros at the beginning of it. It's called the certain number of leading zeros. And if you have a valid nonce which produces a valid hash, then you have discovered a valid Bitcoin block, and you can send that out into the Bitcoin network. We call this the golden nonce. So these machines, which you saw in the data center picture earlier, these machines are specialized. They only do one thing. They're application specific integrated circuit chips, ASICs, that go into a mining rig, and they just go through nonces and produce hashes of block headers from that nonce as fast as possible. And the more hashes they can produce, the more likely it is they will discover and produce a valid block header. So you find the nonce, the golden nonce, hash it, produce a valid block header. You can add transactions to the block, but you've already been doing that from the Merkle root. And then you send that block out into the Bitcoin network and hope that it's accepted. And it usually is, but there's some asterisks around that. If the Bitcoin network accepts the block and adds it to the blockchain, you get paid. That is, you actually assign yourself the payout of the newly created Bitcoin in that block. So you give it to an account that you own. So you send it to an address that you own. Today you get paid about 3.125 Bitcoin per block. That's the newly created Bitcoin each block. We call it the block subsidy, 3.125. And you get the transaction fees that you've included in that block. So right now that's about at 67,000 Bitcoin. That's 200,000 USD for the subsidy plus about 10K for transaction fees. I think it's more like 30 or 40 right now. So that's like $250,000 per block. But
can you, Charlie, let me jump in right now. All right, so they're getting the the reward, right? The subsidy, and then there are all the transaction fees. Can you give some examples of where those transaction fees come from, and what is being stored in that block? Like what kind of data? Like some just
So the block just has all the transactions in it, and as you know, when you send a transaction on Bitcoin, you have to set a fee to that transaction. Now, most wallets will estimate the fee that it takes for you to get that transaction into a block soon. And those are pretty reliable. But as we saw this past week, like we can have massive influxes of people trying to mint new runes. And so the fee rates will rise really quickly as people compete against each other to be first. And all those fees, you take all the fees from all the cumulative transactions which you put into a block, and those get added to the payout from the block. So you get to pay all those fees to yourself for discovering the block. What's in those transactions? It can be normal transactions. It can be more data heavy, witness data. It can be the data blob type that we call inscriptions. And I'll explain those a little bit more. But yeah, you have the subsidy plus the cumulative fees, and normally the fees historically have been lower than the fiat value of the new Bitcoin. But we've seen instances in the past couple of years, thank you to ordinals and fungible tokens on Bitcoin, seen instances of the fees surpassing the block subsidy. And this has kind of been the whole plan or pitch for Bitcoin, that fees drive revenue to miners at some point in the future. This again is nuanced. People will discuss it at length and argue about it. So we've been min-maxing this process. We've been min-maxing the process of going through the nonce fields, producing hashes, and then coordinating the actual payouts and block construction. So pools handle the block headers. They take the transactions, they figure out what the best transactions are, and they handle the coordination of like producing the block header. And the hash producers or the data center operators specialize in the sole business of converting massive amounts of energy into compute, which produces hashes as efficiently as possible. These are now pretty much entirely different types of businesses from an operations standpoint. Because of this, I like to say that Bitcoin miners really don't know very much about Bitcoin. When I say Bitcoin miners, I'm talking about the data center operators. They use all their brain power, as I once myself did, to focus on non-Bitcoin things like procuring energy, building infrastructure, capital formation, and operations. If you talk to a Bitcoin miner at scale, like I showed that picture of Riot blockchain, I think somebody mentioned that was like a picture from Riot from 2022. Like if you were to talk to the C-suite at Riot, um, much love to them, but they really have no idea of the stuff I just explained. They would not be able to explain to you, even at a high level, like this idea of block headers being passed back and forth, and this idea of nonces and golden nonces. They don't really specialize at that type of thing. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Bitcoin mining, because I think it's important to understand like how we got here. Originally in 2009, Satoshi released the Satoshi client to the Cypherpunk mailing list. And this client was kind of like everything. You could mine Bitcoin inside this client. It was a wallet as well. And you could mine Bitcoin on your home computer, your home CPU. What's interesting is that this kind of all-in-one client, which let you broadcast transactions, it was, you know, it managed your keys and your wallet, and it also let you mine inside of it. This is a little bit like how Casey released ordinals. It's very similar to how Casey released Ord, because Casey released the Ord client, which was an explorer. It was a wallet. It constructed the transactions. It also managed like all the things you need to know in order to be ordinals aware. So there's a lot of analogies here between the original Satoshi client and Casey's Ord client. But there is a problem after this, after Satoshi released the client, which is that there's only about 144 blocks per day, blocks every 10 minutes. There's only about 144 Bitcoin blocks a day. That means there's only about 144 payout events to Bitcoin miners each day. So what happens if you have thousands of people now mining Bitcoin? Bitcoin's accrued some value. Maybe Bitcoin is now worth like 50 cents a Bitcoin. It now costs a lot of money to run all this compute at your home and in your garage, and you've got a power bill due. And now statistically, if there's thousands of people mining Bitcoin, you have real world fiat costs to pay that happen, say, every 2 weeks, like a power bill, and you haven't found a block in weeks. Like, what happens? That's where we get into the business of pools. So early on, I think in, was it 2011 or so, Slush Pool formed. It's now called Brains Pool, where